It's always a good week when we get to add a new show to the 1012 network. And so you can imagine how I feel when we get to announce two new shows in the same week. So Monday, if you missed it, well, last Monday, we announced Cincinnati. We've got Viva La Cats. Very excited to have them on board. We're now one podcast away from having the 12 teams who will be in the future Big 12 after Oklahoma and Texas leave. Very excited to welcome Garrett and Jeff, the two hosts of Give 'Em Hell Brigham Young, our new BYU podcast, into the 1012 network. Guys, welcome.
Well, welcome. And it's just Give 'Em Hell Brigham. No Young on there. I know it's confusing. I know
it keeps throwing me off because I just want to say Brigham Young,
Right. And so it is confusing, but we're glad to be here. Who's the one school that we're missing? I mean, we're going to have to probably find an Arizona and Arizona State maybe here in the next month or two, but that should be easy.
Given the latest reporting of what's going down in the Pac-12, they are really stubborn. I mean, those alumni bases are heavy in California. They want to stay connected to California. And, that's what happens when you look down your nose at other people is eventually there's nowhere to look up.
The comeuppance has been an incredible hit of dopamine.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, you guys, BYU is a school and athletic department who has looked at the Pac-12 many times. Like, we play half your schools all the time. Why don't you just invite us? And they're like, no, we would never do such a thing. And now it's like, oh, maybe we should have got BYU when you had a chance. Well, you had many chances. It's like that seeing that other girl, and you're like, I'm not going to date her. And then she marries up, and now you're sitting there all alone at the dance going, well, how come maybe she'll go? Nope, you had your chance, and she's gone, and now she's ours.
After the last 11 years of independence and every West Virginia blogger, every anonymous whoever that had a Twitter account, BYU fans, man, we were clinging to every sort of inkling of hope that we could have. Now that it's here, it's kind of nice to just watch everybody else do the scramble that BYU fans have done for 10 years. Feels really good to be on the right side of that conversation for a change.
And to know that everything is locked up for the next at least 8 seasons until 2031 when the grant of rights runs out, where there's no way that it's gonna fall apart. If anything, we're adding to our party and getting bigger and better, but it won't be it for the first having stability for the first time. I mean, really in my entire life as a fan, because there was purportedly, depending on who you talk to, like the Pac-12 or the Pac-10, they looked into expanding and adding BYU in the 90s, and it got to the point where it was like they had everything prepared and doing we're going to have a president's vote even to invest, but then it kind of got kiboshed because it was one of those things where it was like they didn't have a formal vote because after doing a straw poll, they realized the votes weren't there, so they didn't bother putting it on the agenda, kind of thing. But it's from my entire life, I remember one of my earliest memories is when the Mountain West formed and breaking up the WAC, and I was just kind of old enough to ask then, what's going on, and my dad explaining it to me. But then even as soon as the Mountain West was formed, it was kind of like, well, yeah, but we want to be in the Big 12, and then we want to be in the Pac-12. We still don't feel like we belong here, and now we were independent for just as long as we were in the Mountain West, which is a really weird thing to wrap our mind around, that we spent the same amount of time in both situations. And it just feels good to finally be in a place where I can point the finger and laugh at everyone else's demise while knowing that we are safely and firmly middle class.
How does it feel as BYU fans to know that all your sports will finally be in one conference as opposed to spread out in multiple different locations?
I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask because, truthfully, aside from BYU football, I'm not really convinced other sports exist. I mean, obviously they do, but they kind of don't unless it's March. So for me, I mean, no change really. But on a serious note, I mean, it's awesome, right? I mean, it is nice to the Mountain West Conference of old, right? I mean, it was what it was. But it was fun. It was fun to have a conference chase. It was fun to, hang banners of conference titles in the rafters of the Marriott Center. It was fun to have, Jimmer Fredette had rivalries with Kawhi Leonard and San Diego State. So it was fun. Those kinds of things were fun. And you don't get that as an independent. There were a lot of other things that were fun about independence. And there were a lot of things that were fun about the West Coast Conference for those non-football sports. But it will be more fun to have everything under one roof and get to know the same people, get to form the same rivals, have the same arguments with the same fan bases, year in and year out, regardless of the sport. It's fun. And I don't think, for me personally, during independence, during the West Coast Conference, I think we all kind of lied to ourselves as BYU fans, saying that we didn't care as much about that kind of stuff as we really did, because we had to, right? I mean, independence was it. You didn't really have any other option. So we convinced ourselves that it was okay. Now that it's not, and now that BYU is headed to the Big 12, like all of those things, oh, I can't wait for that. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I mean, most of the WCC, most of the Olympic sports are pretty good. It's a lot of, because generally the Olympic sports, the kind of more affluent West Coast, a lot of the schools being in California, like the volleyball, the softball, the golf, a lot of those, sports, the WCC did a very good job at. And but with basketball, just like the margin of error playing behind Gonzaga, because there was just zero depth in the league, was so low that if you dropped one or two, if you lost a conference game to anyone besides Gonzaga and St. Mary's, you could kiss your tournament hopes goodbye, unless you won the conference tournament, which you're probably not going to do because you have to go through both Gonzaga and St. Mary's. It's a tough road to hoe. And so it's having where the entire season is meaningful, rather than it's like people get up for St. Mary's or Gonzaga and then the rest, it's like, oh yeah, there's a basketball game tonight, I'll watch it. But then if it's just it having a competitive depth, and then also just having the sheer number of fans, like I've never met a single LMU fan or Santa Clara fan, right, in my entire life. So it's like, I don't even know who, like the banter on, Twitter or on a Discord server, like it just doesn't exist to interact with fans of other schools other than Gonzaga fans. There's a few of them, it just, the opportunity just isn't there. And so I think actually we'll feel like really in a conference for the first time in a long time.
How's it feel to know that you're joining a conference that men's basketball programs, there was legitimate debate as to whether or not they could get all 10 teams into the NCAA tournament this year?
Oh, it's great because we can go 500 in conference play and still make the tourney. That's great.
I was going to go the other direction. I don't know if it feels that great for me, because I think once BYU is added, the debate of can you get 100% of the Big 12 teams in the conference or in the tournament, well, that goes out the window because BYU's not good enough to get into the tournament. So it will be good for the long term for sure. But man, it feels like a buzzsaw, in the immediate future. It scares me.
So tell me a little bit about you guys. We've talked about BYU, and I feel like BYU, we could go for 2 hours, because BYU feels like the one fan base. Part of this, you guys are the last edition as far as the incoming programs I have a podcast for, but it seems like BYU fans are the ones I have had the least interaction with on social media, from the 1012 Network's Twitter account. Tell me a little bit about you guys, so everybody kind of gets familiar with Give 'em Hell Brigham. Tell me the history of this particular podcast.
So I don't know, Jeff, when did we start talking to each other? It was like
years.
2050. So fun fact, Jeff and I have only been together in person one time in our entire life. So we met
Welcome to sports podcasting.
Right. So we started following on Twitter and started talking. We started talking to each other, and kind of went from there. And then Jeff was working, I think that was the pre-Rivals days, and then when Jeff ran over to Rivals and we talked to each other for a while, as he asked if I wanted to help out, and so that's why I kind of started running there. And then we moved to 24/7 together, and then we started the show kind of during the lockdown. It was like May of 2020. We're like, let's start a show. And then after running the show through that 2020 season, we said, let's start a newsletter to go with it. And so we'll spin it off, because it doesn't, 24/7, the kind of content that you get there on 24/7, it's very, how do you say, like formulaic, like what they want you to do. It's like, it's recapping a recruiting visit. It's recapping a recruiting visit. It's giving a post-game summary of what happened, which is just very that's available everywhere. Right. And so it's, there's a million sites where you can do that. And so we said the newsletter isn't going to fit into that style, and so let's kind of spin it off and do so that's where we kind of evolved from being just the podcast to the letter pod, as we affectionately call it. And so it's been really good. Yeah, so we're coming up on 3 years now with the show and just hit about 18 months with the newsletter, and things are going really well.
It's a ton of fun, and we use the word fanfluencer because influencers are awful. Nobody wants to be an influencer, but we try to consider ourselves fanfluencers. That we're not going to sit and break down X's and O's a ton. We do a little bit, but like neither one of us really know what we're talking about. But we're going to have fun, and so our newsletter, our podcast, we really try to keep it in the mold of like it's the tailgate, and you're just sitting around with your friends talking about the things you talk about while you're waiting for the game to start, right? And so we have a lot of fun. It is a little bit different than your traditional sports outlet, but we still get that sports fix, but we do it in a different way than I think most people do, and it's been a lot of fun. And we've had a lot of success with it.
So for those who might want to sign up for the newsletter, where can they do so? Because I don't think I subscribe to nearly enough newsletters yet. I should add
you can sign up at givehimhellbrigham.com.
Very cool. All right, well, that's easy enough. So how long have you guys been BYU fans? Did you grow up BYU fans? Did it become once you got to school? What's your connection and relationship with the university?
For me, it's easy. My grandfather used to check me out of school. I live, I don't know, an hour and a half out of Provo. I didn't go to BYU, but my grandfather would check me out of school when I was a kid, and he would drag me to LaVell Edwards Stadium. At the time, it was Cougar Stadium, and he would plant my butt on a bleacher chair. And we'd sit there and we'd watch football games. And that was the relationship that we had. And it was just ingrained into me that you're a BYU fan no matter what you do. He didn't care what else. I could have been some kind of hardened criminal, but as long as I wore BYU blue while I did it, he would have been proud of me. And ultimately, that's just stuck with me. So it's been a lifelong thing for me. Never attended the school, but just have never been able to get that royal blue out of my blood.
And for me, so I did go to BYU, and it really, for me, it goes a lot deeper. So obviously BYU is an LDS university. So my dad's stepbrother joined the LDS church my dad's stepbrother was offered, and so he played under LaVell Edwards, and so he was going to BYU, and he joined the church there. And my parents went to visit them. My dad was looking at going to Colorado State, wanted an ag program, and in a weird turn of events decided like, hey, I want to go to BYU instead with my stepbrother. And so it was at the end of my dad's first semester in Provo, my parents joined and converted and joined the LDS church. And so for me, it's more than just sports, because obviously, our religion, Jeff and I are both active members of the LDS church. Like our religion is such an important part of my life, that it's in my life, it's very strictly tied, closely tied to the university itself and specifically the sports, right? Because if LaVell hadn't offered my uncle a chance to play, who knows, where things would be. So I went to school there. That's where I met my wife, also went to BYU. And so that's where we met. And so it's very, very much the kind of stereotypical in that regard of like, I'm not only am I an alumni, but because I am a good LDS person, I cheer for BYU just like all Catholics should cheer for Notre Dame.
Is that I assume growing up, that's just the rules. Like, I don't know, by the way, and here's your BYU shirt. It's the first time you show up to church. Here you go.
No, there's
it should be the rules.
It should be. It should be. So we had this conversation on our Discord the other night. So the Arizona State's biggest donor, who was their single biggest donor, who played football also at Arizona State back in the day, he is LDS, and so he's also given like over $50 million to BYU just because he's like, it's the church school. So the school of the engineering colleges at both universities are both named after him because of his donations. But yeah, I know it's like that. There's actually like a lot of people who or like where it's, I mean, obviously if you're a Utah fan or whatever, but there's a lot of people that live in like Idaho or Wyoming that cheer for Boise State or what the University of Wyoming that are like, no, like we wear it as this badge of honor that we are LDS, and I don't cheer for BYU. So there's a little bit of that, but everyone should be required to. As a theological point of doctrine, I feel like the fandom should be required.
The fact that there is not an official BYU indoctrination program within the church is just mind-boggling.
Well, it's because the podcast has only existed for 3 years, Phillip. Oh, okay. I mean, give us some time. We'll make sure it gets there.
That'll be coming out in the newsletter over the coming months.
No, absolutely.
Bit by bit. Understand. I mean, so from BYU standpoint, like you kind of touched on it. To me, from an athletic department as a whole, it's BYU feels like the one most prepared to enter the Big 12. Obviously, from a football standpoint, I think Cincinnati will be fine outside of the coaching change. Houston, they spend in some ways like a Power 5 program. UCF, I think, is going to be fine. But from a whole, holistically as an athletic department, because you guys play so many Power 5 games, because you guys act in some ways similar to a Pac-12 school where all the sports kind of matter from an athletic standpoint. And I think there are a lot of Big 12 programs that, yes, football is king. Men's basketball is just right next to the king. But everyone else has certain things that they are thoroughly invested in as an athletic department. You got a lot of baseball, wrestling, golf, softball throughout the conference. And BYU feels like, to me, the program that's coming in as an athletic department that is best suited to immediately have success kind of across the board versus some of the other schools that are entering.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. I mean, obviously there's going to be, maybe the baseball program at UCF, I have no idea. Maybe the baseball program is a little bit more prepared than BYU's, but I think generally speaking, BYU across the board will be pretty prepared in just about every sport. And it feels like that's kind of engraved in Mormon culture. Like, I don't know how to explain it other than when members of the church want their kids to do extracurricular things. And so kids grow up playing all the sports, doing all of the things. And it kind of creates this natural recruiting pool for BYU to go out and get the track kid out of Massachusetts, who's like this budding track star, because that's what they've done their whole life. And because they're members of the church, they want to go to BYU, or they are at least aware of BYU, and BYU is able to go and on a track scholarship or a half, whatever they do, right? They're able to go and get kids out of Massachusetts to come and run track at BYU. And I think that, regionally speaking, at least, I don't know, aside from a handful of schools that I think do that across the country, regardless of sport, BYU is kind of unique in that regard, that they can, because of their affiliation with the church, they kind of can go anywhere that there's a member of the church and have some reasonable recruiting success. And because of just the nature and the DNA of what families who are members of the church do, there's a lot of kids doing extracurricular things. It isn't always football. Like, there's a lot of track and field stars, right? That grow up in the church and then they go to BYU, and hey, look, BYU has a really good cross country team as a result. So it's interesting. It's one of those things that you don't really think about. And I think for anybody on the outside of BYU looking at it, it's like that's one of the weirder recruiting pools that I've ever heard. But it makes sense for BYU, and they've done it for decades now and have had pretty consistent success.
Yeah, I think it's pretty standard, or kind of the norm in LDS families, that every kid is expected to both play a sport and either like sing in the choir or like play some type of musical instrument. Like, if you're not, you have to do something, right? Pick an instrument and pick a sport. And most of the time it's like, you got to do both. And so I think not only does BYU probably have more married players than any other football program in the country.
I think you make that sound like a little bit too, Mike, I have 3 kids. We don't play instruments.
Okay. Our parents' generation, it was like, but I think also, in addition to having the most married players of any school in the country, we probably have the most football players who can also play the piano. That is, I'm something very confident in. But so it's in other sports. I mean, if you look at, was it the Learfield Cup or whatever, it's like that fake trophy that they give out to try to say like we're the best overall, like well-rounded athletic department thing that Stanford wins every year because they sponsor like 87,000 varsity sports. We consistently do really, really well in pretty much across the board. So we've had last couple of years, we've won titles in like cross country or track in like both men's and women's, and done multiple things. The women's volleyball team has played for multiple national titles in the last 5-6 years. So I think across the board, it's really holistic. And then also, I think, it's a really unique situation with the 4 schools coming in from the football side of things, where, you've got Gus Malzahn at UCF, who was, the head coach at Auburn forever. Dana Holgerson is obviously very familiar with the Big 12, and now Fickle left, but you have Scott Satterfield at Cincy, who, spent time in the ACC. So I think, and then also Cincinnati, their school is not unfamiliar with the transition going, when they went from Conference USA into the Big East, and, were a reviewed clock in the Big 12 championship game away from playing Alabama for a national title, in the BCS era. So I think all four schools are really poised in terms of they know what they need to do to compete at this level. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think I'm not familiar enough with their Olympics in other sports, but I definitely think that we are poised to come in and compete right away.
We'll wrap on this. Obviously, a Big 12 fans got I would say a mouthful of an understanding of UCF fans on Twitter. Cincinnati fans on there got involved heavily as well. There was some smattering of Houston. I didn't see a lot of BYU when it came down to that. So kind of what is the BYU fan base like? What are we going to get a lot of Twitter and social media interaction? Is that somewhere where are they a very online fan base like many of the Big 12s are?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is definitely. You probably haven't seen a whole lot of BYU interaction because we're still trying to win the arguments with Utah fans and the rest of the Pac-12. But as soon as those arguments are settled, then BYU fans will make their way over to the rest of the Big 12 for sure.
So I don't know, maybe we need a list of who to follow from every school. So we can know, and I've followed and I've kind of sought out some, and if a Big 12 fan pops up on my timeline, I'll try to follow them and kind of see and what's going on, but definitely, wanting to get more into that. But yes, when you talk about like toxic rivalries, I think the online interactions between BYU and Utah fans, it is unbearable. Like I just have everybody, like I just have to mute everybody. I have so many people muted or blocked because I'm just like, I cannot deal with this. So it is both sides are overly passionate. And so I think having some new faces to interact with will be very welcome.
If fans of the 10-12 network, Big 12 fans, if they want to find BYU fans online, just say something about Utah and we'll find you. I promise.
just gotta know what keywords, hashtags to use to attract.
That's all it takes. Say Kyle Whittingham.
If you tweet out something about BYU in 1984, you will also have like every single Utah fan in existence will be in your mentions. And I feel comfortable saying that, not as, my bias of hating everything about them. Because I grew up in a house where my parents, when I was growing up, they said, obviously tuition at BYU or, and there's also like other church colleges, is very subsidized by the LDS Church. My parents said, we will help you up to the cost of going to a church school, wherever you go, as we can, unless you go to the University of Utah, then you will not get a dime from us. And so that was my life growing up, which is good. I think that is good parenting, but but it's, even like national writers, like there's like Stuart Mandel and Andy Staples, there have been like national people saying like who make fun of how incessant Utah fans are on Twitter. And it is very funny to me, especially with all the events of the last week with the realignment stuff, that like the comeuppance is just so I'm relishing in it because we have waited for this moment for the past 12 years since 2011, or I guess 13 years since 2010, when it was announced that we were leaving the Mountain West, of, finally finding our home and leaving them behind, presumably in the dust. And so that will, but yes, if you are listening to this, come find us and come interact with us. And I know there is a 1012 network Discord, so I joined that. You sent me the link. So it's not super active, but yeah, let's find a community of Big 12 fans that we can all hang out together.
We're working on that. Everybody make sure you are following Give 'em Hell Brigham on Twitter at Give 'em Hell Pod. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you want. The 1012 Network has an official network policy of Colorado, Arizona, and Arizona State are welcome to the Big 12. Utah fans were the most, and I don't understand it at all, the most down their nose at the Big 12 as though they are somehow...
So you've seen it too. Okay, it's not just... thank you for the validation.
No fan base of the Pac-12. None of them were more snobby about the Big 12 than Utah, because Utah, obviously the corner four, and so they were like, how dare you would assume that we wouldn't, like, fine, cool, go play with Oregon and Washington on your own. And we know Arizona wants to come. ASU's being a little picky about it. Colorado's problem is I think they probably would, but their alumni base is so heavy in California that it's hard to make that shift. Utah is so arrogant, and they can.
I can promise you, if BYU were to have been invited to the Pac-12 last year, and now BYU's go to the Pac-12, and now the Big 12 is talking about the corner schools. Oh, Utah would be ready to run. It has nothing to do with the Big 12 conference. It has everything to do with BYU. It is nuts. This rivalry is nuts.
they have spent the last decade pounding their chest that they have left us in the dust and are better than us in every way. So the thought of being on par and equal with us now is just, they cannot wrap their heads around that. So they can go be in the Mountain West 2.0, I guess, after they invite SMU and all 7 SMU fans.
The Pac-10 plus 2. You guys have been awesome. The show is incredible. Thrilled to have you in the network. Glad to have the BYU representation. This just leaves us one show short. We've got to figure out TCU. We'll work on that. I'm working on it. July 1st. That's the date. That's the date. If all I've got to do left is one show between now and July 1st, maybe I can swing that. 3 kids 4 and under is a lot. You guys cannot wait. Everybody in the 1012 network, every 1012 listener, go check out Give Him Hell Brigham. As I said, Give Him Hell Pod on Twitter, and you can find the Twitter links to our good friends here, Jeff and Garrett. Guys, welcome to the network.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.
Give him hell.